She was 24 years old and, for all practical purposes, unemployed. The grant committee had cut her name from the roster in a single line of institutional prose, funding regrettably reallocated, and with that line went 2 years of fieldwork. A shared apartment lease in Ankara, and the tenuous respect of a department that had never quite decided whether she was a scholar or a nuisance. In the inner pocket of her canvas coat sat a small brass plumb bob on a frayed cotton line. The last thing her father had pressed into her palm before the scaffolding collapsed on a restoration site in Izmir. It was scratched, unlovely, weighted with lead. And it steadied her the way other people were steadied by prayer. On the strength of a single sentence in a 19th-century traveler's memoir and $487 in savings. She wired the fee for a one-way seat on a rural cooperative bus and a 3-week permit to survey a nowhere hillside in central Cappadocia, a purchase that everyone she loved, and several she did not, would later call the most foolish thing she had ever done. What nobody knew, not the committee, not her uncle, not the drivers who moved her from one dusty terminal to the next, was that she had been reading the ground beneath that hillside for 6 years in secret, and she was almost certain that something was waiting under it. So pour yourself something warm, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and settle in. This is the story of Elif Damla Aksoy, of a plumb bob on a cotton line, and of the door that had not been opened in 200 years. Elif had been shaped, from the beginning, by 2 opposing gravities. Her father, Kamal, was a stone mason of the old school, a man whose forearms smelled always of lime dust and cold water and whose hands, when he took her small ones in his to show her how to feel for the true face of a block, were as warm and finely calloused as sun-dried leather. He would talk to a wall the way other men talked to horses, coaxing, respectful, occasionally stern, and by the time Elif was 9 she could tell a Seljuk course from an Ottoman patch by touch alone, in the dark, with her eyes closed. He taught her the plumb bob, the level, the chisel, the patient geometry by which a building either stood for 1,000 years or fell in one, and he taught her, above all, that a structure was an argument written in stone, and that a good mason spent her life learning to read it. He died on a Tuesday in November, when a temporary platform gave beneath a colleague's carelessness. And the last thing he did before they carried him out was to fold her fingers around the plumb bob and say, quietly, Kazim, always find the true line. The building will tell you where it is, if you are willing to listen. Her mother she remembered less clearly, a low, dry cough behind a curtain when Elif was 5. The smell of eucalyptus oil on a damp cloth, a hand that had briefly rested on her forehead and then, one gray morning, had not been there anymore. After the second funeral, the practical arithmetic of the family delivered her to her uncle Mahmut in Ankara, a wholesale textile merchant who kept a spotless office above his warehouse and who took her in, as he made clear at once, because it was what a decent man did with a brother's orphan. Not because he had any particular use for a quiet child with dust under her fingernails. In his world, life was a ledger book of profit and loss. In her father's world, life had been the elegant logic of a machine that a careful hand could keep turning for centuries. By day, Elif learned Mahmut's world flawlessly, double-entry bookkeeping at 12, inventory management at 14, customs paperwork at 16, and by night, in the small room above the stairwell, she read her father's brittle notebooks and the yellowed schematics he had collected from Byzantine crypts and Cappadocian rock-cut churches. And she copied their sections in pencil until the plumb bob's weight against her hip felt like a second heartbeat. The dismissal came on a Wednesday in early March, and it came, as such things do, dressed as ordinary administration. Mahmut's eldest son had married a woman with a business degree, and the young couple would be moving into the apartment above the warehouse. The room above the stairwell was needed. Elif's graduate stipend from the university had, coincidentally, not been renewed. Mahmut delivered all of this across the polished walnut of his desk, without asking her to sit, his eyes on a column of figures rather than on her face. "It is not personal, Elif," he said, in the flat tone he used for suppliers who had missed a delivery. "You are 24 years old. You have an education. It is time. I have written a check for 12,000 lira, it is generous, more than your father left, and it will carry you until you find a position. You will thank me for this, in time." She stood very still, the plumb bob a small cold weight against her ribs, and she said only, "Thank you, uncle. I understand." That evening she packed, in a canvas duffel and a hard-sided instrument case, for changes of clothing, her father's leather-bound field notebook, a folding rule and a small brass theodolite, the plumb bob wrapped in a square of blue cloth, and the photograph of her parents on their wedding day. In the framed family portrait in the hallway, Mamet, his wife, their 3 children ranged on a studio bench. There had never been a place for a 4th child, and there was not one now. She noticed this, without resentment, on her way out. She closed the office door quietly behind her so that the latch made no sound, and on the stairs the plumb bob knocked once against her hip, a small honest weight, and she was steadied. The bus south from Ankara took 11 hours, and it took them badly. Dust came in through the sealed windows in a fine ochre film that settled on eyelashes and teeth, the afternoon heat pooled in the aisle. And a farmer with a cage of chickens sat pressed against her shoulder for the last 3 hours of the journey without either of them speaking. Elif kept her father's notebook open on her lap and read it by the failing light, and she found, somewhere between Aksoy and Nevşehir, that she was not afraid. One cannot truly lose what one never possessed, she thought. Mamet had never given her a home, only a room, and a room is a much smaller thing to leave behind. In the last town before her stop, waiting for a connecting minibus, she read a hand-lettered notice tacked to the wall of the coffee house, a hillside parcel, 140 dönüm. Back taxes owing since 1938, offered by the provincial administration to any party willing to settle the debt. The place was called Cappadocia, Lost Stream, and the name sat in her chest with the small quiet click of a key turning. Cappadocia, when the minibus set her down in its single square at 4 in the afternoon, was a town defined by what was no longer there. The stream that had given it its name had gone underground in the earthquake of 1912 and had never come back up. The cotton fields that had lived off the stream had died with it. The population, which had once been 600, was now 87. The houses were the color of old bone, roofed in flat earth that had cracked in the sun, and above them, on the low rise at the town's northern edge, stood the thing Elif had come 600 kilometers to see. It was a stone caravanserai, 13th century by its arch and its portal, absurd in that empty place, magnificent in the last of the afternoon light, and utterly abandoned. Its outer wall was 40 meters to a side, its great iron-bound gate hung half off one hinge, swallows moved through its upper courses in a soft grey cloud. She stood in the square with her duffel at her feet and looked up at it, and she thought, with the calm certainty that had been growing in her since Ankara, that here was a forgotten ledger entry. A building that the world had crossed out and walked away from, just like her. The provincial land officer worked out of a room at the back of the post office, and he was a thin, grey-moustached man named Bayram Bey who did not stand up when she came in. "You wish to buy the Han," he said, when she had explained herself, and he took off his glasses and polished them slowly, as though this were the appropriate response to a joke that was not quite funny. "You understand it is called the Aptal's Han here, the Fool's Han. Every 10 years someone comes. Every 10 years they leave. The roof is bad. There is no water. The road is a track." She said she understood. He named the sum, 4,780 lira in back taxes, filing fees, and the provincial transfer stamp, a figure that would leave her, when it was paid, with 462 lira in her pocket. Plus the $487 in traveler's checks that were her father's small inheritance turned into a working reserve. She counted the money out on the corner of his desk in 10s and 20s and a small tower of 1 lira coins. And Bayram Bey watched the tower grow with the expression of a man watching an unlikely rain, and at the end he said, "Well, may God grant you patience, Miss Aksoy, you will need it in that quantity." He wrote the deed in a long, looping hand, sanded the ink dry from a wooden shaker of fine sand, pressed the provincial seal into a small pool of red wax, and slid the brittle document across to her, and by 6 in the evening on the 14th of March, Elif Damla Aksoy owned a caravanserai that no one had wanted for 200 years. Inside, past the great gate, the courtyard was 50 paces across and open to the sky, and the dust in the arcades that ran around it lay thick as a folded blanket. She walked its perimeter first, the way her father had taught her to walk any building, outside walls first, then inside, then up. Then down, and she counted 22 cells opening off the ground floor arcade, each one small and vaulted and dry, and above them a second story of larger chambers reached by a broad stone stair. At the back of the courtyard, opposite the gate, stood the hammam and the little mosque. And behind those the deep vaulted stables where camels had once slept 40 at a time under a barrel ceiling 10 meters high. There was decay everywhere, a fallen beam in the stables, birds' nests in the Iwan. A great pale bloom of saltpetre on the north wall, but when she laid her palm against the first pier of the arcade and pressed her ear to the stone and knocked, once, with her knuckle, the sound that came back was low and long and whole. The core was sound. The bones of the building were still speaking. She stood in the darkening courtyard and let the plumb bob out to the length of its cotton line, and it hung, dead straight and dead still. Over the well cover at the courtyard center, the true line, her father had said, the building will tell you, and she understood, in that first hour, that she had not bought a ruin. She had bought a home that was waiting to be woken up. She chose, for the first week, the smallest and driest of the ground floor cells, the one nearest the gate, 3 meters by 4. With a barrel vault a hand's breadth above her head, and she made it habitable one small victory at a time. On the first day she swept, dust in a fine dry cloud that she drove out into the courtyard with a broom of tide time. On the second day she patched a fist-sized hole in the vault with lime mortar mixed from a sack she found in the stables. And she was pleased to discover that her father's proportions still lived in her hands. On the third day she cleared the flue of the little corner fireplace. And the swallow's nest she pulled out of it was as thick as her forearm and full of the small brittle bones of 2 centuries of chicks. Water was the precious thing. The well in the courtyard was 15 meters deep and gave a bucket at a time of stone-cold, iron-tasting water, and she rationed it, 2 liters for drinking. 1 for washing, 1 for the mortar, and she carried each bucket up the arcade steps herself and set it down with the small satisfaction of a person balancing a ledger she had chosen. On the 4th evening, at dusk, she lit her first fire of dried thyme and pine. And she ate a bowl of hot lentil soup by its light with the great vaulted ceiling above her flickering in the small red glow, and that vault of light was, she thought, a small pocket of civilization in an ocean of dust, and she had built it herself. At the top of the broad stone stair, on the western side of the second story, there was a door that would not open. It was oak, banded in black iron, and the iron was welded to itself by 2 centuries of rust. The lock beneath the handle was a great Ottoman keyhole the length of her hand. And the mechanism inside it, when she put her ear to it, was frozen solid. On the 8th day she tried the method her father had taught her for old locks, a length of stiff wire, a paperclip flattened and bent. Patient small movements against the wards, and she worked at it for 3 hours by lamplight and got nothing but bruised knuckles and a wire bent into a small silver question mark. On the 9th day she gave up on the lock and went to work on the hinges instead, and this took her 4 days, unscrewing what would unscrew, chipping mortar from the pins with a masonry chisel, prying with a length of iron bar found in the stables, pausing every hour to rest her back and to drink water she could not really spare. Her knuckles bled, split and resplit, and on the afternoon of the 12th day the upper hinge came free with a small dry crack and the door leaned outward toward her like a great tired animal. And she caught it with her shoulder and eased it down. The air that came out of the room was old. Not bad, not foul, old, dry, closed, the air of a book that has not been opened in a very long time. She stood on the threshold and let it settle and then she stepped in with the oil lamp raised. The room was 5 meters by 7, its walls whitewashed once and now the color of milky tea, and it was furnished as though someone had walked out of it one evening intending to come back. A walnut desk stood under the single high window, its surface bare but for a brass inkwell, a steel nib pen laid across it, and a leather-bound logbook closed on the pen. A narrow iron bedstead with a folded grey blanket stood against the eastern wall. A tin trunk sat at the foot of the bed. A small brazier, cold, held the grey ghost of its last fire. On a peg beside the door hung a long dark coat of good wool, and beneath the coat a pair of dust-white boots stood side by side, laces neatly tied. The dust on everything lay so evenly that it looked less like dust than like a fine grey snow that had fallen once and been left in peace. She sat down in the walnut chair, it creaked but held, and she opened the logbook. The first entry was dated the 9th of April, 1826, and it was written in a careful, upright hand in Ottoman Turkish, and the writer named himself, Ibrahim Effendi, Han Keeper. In the 43rd year of his tenure, in the service of the Vakif of the Blessed Foundation of Nevşehir. The entries were short and dry and, at first, ordinary, caravans arriving from Konya, from Aleppo, from Kayseri, 28 camels stabled on a Tuesday. A merchant of copperware paying his fee in 3 good pots and a small bag of salt. And then, slowly, over the pages, the entries began to change. In 1828 the stream ran low for the first time. In 1830 the cotton harvest failed. In 1832 the Vakif stipend arrived 3 months late and half short. In 1834 a full month passed without a single caravan. The handwriting stayed upright and careful but grew smaller, thriftier of ink, and the tone stayed level as a mason's rule. And Elif read on into the night with the plumb bob laid on the desk beside the lamp. The final entry was dated the 2nd of September, 1836. It said, in its entirety, "The road has forgotten us. I am the last. I have set my house in order. May the one who comes after find what I could not spend." She read that line 3 times, and then she set the logbook aside and stood up and walked, slowly, around the room. Her father's voice was in her ear, "The building will tell you where it is, if you are willing to listen," and she moved along the walls, tapping every 3rd stone with the back of her knuckle. The walls answered her, low and long and whole, low and long and whole, and then, on the north wall behind the head of the bed, the stone answered her differently, a small dry note, higher, hollower. Wrong. She moved the bed aside. She knelt. She ran her palm across the plaster. There was a hairline seam, no thicker than a hair, running in a rectangle the size of a folded newspaper. She pressed the upper right corner of the rectangle, gently, then more firmly, and something inside the wall clicked. And a small stone panel swung out on a pivot that had been oiled 200 years ago and still remembered how to move. Inside the compartment were 3 things. The first was a soft leather pouch, and when she opened it, it held 240 gold Ottoman lira, heavy coins bright as the day they had been struck. Stamped with the tugra of Sultan Mahmud II, and the weight of them in her palm was extraordinary, cold and dense and quiet. The second was a small square of red silk, folded and tied with a thread, and inside the silk was a silver key the length of her little finger, cool and simple, with a worn ribbon of green cotton knotted through its bow. The third was a folded letter, sealed with a small circle of dark wax, and on its outer face, in the same upright hand as the logbook, was written, "To whomsoever, in some later year, opens this door." She broke the seal and read the letter beside the lamp, and when she had finished it she read it again. Ibrahim Effendi had been born in 1758 in the village of Urgup, had married a woman named Ice in 1782, had lost her and both of their sons to the cholera of 1794. And had come to the Han in 1793 as an assistant and had never left it. He had watched the stream fail and the caravans thin and the village empty, and he had understood, by the middle of the 1830s, that the road on which the Han stood was no longer a road. He had, over 43 years, put by from his salary and from his tips and from small sensible trades in copper and in salt the sum of 240 gold lira, and he had kept it, he wrote. Not out of greed but out of stubbornness, because a building such as this one ought not to die of neglect, and one day, please God, someone will come who has the patience and the vision to find worth in what everyone else has abandoned. The silver key, he added, opened a small door in the outer wall of the hammam, behind which he had left his own tools, he hoped the finder would use them well. He signed the letter with his full name, and beneath his name, in a smaller hand, as though it had been added later on a different evening, he had written, "I have been happy here. Do not be sorry for me." Elif sat for a long time with the letter in one hand and the gold in her lap, and then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the plumb bob and set it on the desk beside the silver key. She looked at the two small objects, the brass and the silver, side by side in the yellow lamplight. One was a guide to true things, she thought, the other was a permission to build them. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard arcades with the small dry sound of a hand turning a page. She understood, with a clarity that was neither triumph nor grief, that the gold was not hers to spend on herself. It was a gift from one keeper of the Han to the next, and it was meant to be spent on the Han. She would stay. She would honor Ibrahim Effendi by finishing what he had begun, and she would do it, as he had done it, with patience and with vision and with her hands. Her plan, which she wrote out on the last blank pages of her father's field notebook over the next 3 evenings, was specific and modest. The Caravanserai would become 2 things, joined at the courtyard, a small Hanan workshop, 10 of the ground floor cells restored as clean, cheap rooms for the modern travelers who were. She had noticed, beginning to trickle through Cappadocia in dusty rented cars, geologists, archaeologists, foreign hikers with rucksacks, and the great vaulted stables at the back rebuilt as a stone and timber restoration workshop, where she would take in the small, careful jobs the nearby villages could not do for themselves, a cracked lintel here, a slumped vault there, a broken millstone recut. The lodging would pay the bills. The workshop would keep her father's trade alive. That was the argument the building was making, she thought, if one was willing to listen to it, and she wrote it down carefully in pencil, and she underlined it once. She went into Nevşehir on the next market day with a written list and a canvas satchel of gold coins that she had, with some small effort, exchanged in 3 separate transactions at 3 separate banks for a more ordinary stack of lira. She bought, in specific and considered quantities, 80 planks of seasoned pine for scaffolding and shutters, 420 kilos of hydraulic lime in paper sacks, 6 panes of window glass each 60 by 90 centimeters wrapped in straw, 11 kilos of hand-forged nails in 3 sizes, 2 5-liter tins of linseed oil, a small barrel of iron oxide pigment, and, after some thought, a second-hand cast-iron stove for the room that would become the kitchen. The merchants of the Nevşehir market, who had watched her arrive on foot with a plumb bob in her pocket and a list in her hand, treated her at first with the amused patience of men waiting for a story to end. By the 3rd market day, when she came back for a second load of lime and paid in exact coin and asked, in careful mason's language, for a particular grade of sand from a particular quarry, the amusement had been replaced by something quieter and more useful, which was respect. The work itself took her, in the end, 13 months, and she remembered afterwards not the months but the individual projects. She rehung the great gate on new pins forged in Nevşehir, and she oiled the iron until it moved on her shoulder with the small heavy sigh of a thing remembering its job. She repointed the entire southern arcade with lime mortar tinted a shade darker than the original stone, working from a scaffold she had built herself, 1 course at a time. From dawn until the afternoon light went flat. She rebuilt the fallen section of the stable roof in the traditional way, juniper beams laid close, brushwood cross-hatched over them, 30 centimeters of packed earth on top, sloped just enough to shed the winter rain, and when she poured the first bucket of water across it in a test and watched the water run cleanly to the gutter, she stood for a full minute with her hands on her hips and said nothing at all. The first of the townspeople to come up the hill to see her was Hassan Usta, the retired stonemason of Cappadocia, 71 years old, who arrived on the 9th day of her work carrying his own trowel wrapped in a cloth. He stood in the courtyard and watched her mix a batch of lime mortar without speaking. And when she had finished he came over and took a pinch of the mortar between his thumb and forefinger and rubbed it and sniffed it, and he said, "Too wet. By a hand." She adjusted the mix. He watched her lay 3 stones. He grunted. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and by the end of the second week he was bringing his own lunch and staying until the light failed, and he told her. One evening as they sat on the courtyard wall and shared a piece of bread, "Your father was Kemal Aksoy of Izmir, no?" "I thought so. Your hands are his hands. Now, that lintel on the north side, we do it together tomorrow, because alone you will hurt yourself." The second was iced teas. The widow who ran the tiny bread oven behind the mosque in the square, who began, in the third week, to leave a small parcel wrapped in a red cloth on the stone bench outside the great gate every second morning. There was always a round of flat bread inside, still warm, and there was sometimes a piece of white cheese, and there was sometimes, when the day looked especially cold, a small tin of stewed apricots. Elif tried, on the first morning, to pay for the bread, and iced teas, who could not have been more than 4.5 feet tall, took her hand between her two small hard ones and said only, "Child, you are living in a stone box on a hill. Eat." After that Elif did not try to pay. She began, instead, to bring iced teas a small jar of the linseed oil each month for her wooden dough trough, and this exchange, wordless and even, became the small warm hinge of her mornings. The third was Yusuf, the blacksmith of the next village over. A wiry man of 38 who came up the hill on the day she was struggling to forge the great iron strap for the rehung gate and who took one look at her improvised charcoal fire in the courtyard, and laughed out loud, not unkindly, and said, "No, no, no, no. Bring it to my forge. Tonight." That evening she walked the 8 kilometers to his village with the strap over her shoulder, and Yusuf turned up the bellows and beat the iron flat for her while she held the tongs. And when he saw the small punched maker's mark on the head of her father's chisel, K.A., Izmir, 1978, he stopped the hammer in mid-swing and looked at her over the anvil and said, "Kemal Aksoy. He rebuilt the mihrab in our village mosque in 1991. He was the finest hand I ever watched. Are you his?" And she said yes, and he nodded once, and after that Yusuf came up the hill on Saturdays and worked beside her without fee for the whole afternoon. And she went down to his forge on Wednesdays and did the same. They were not, she understood, none of the three of them were, friends in the ordinary sense, they were something older and steadier than that, which was a community built out of shared work. Months turned into a year, and then the year turned into 15 months. And one bright cold morning in the June of the following year Elif stood in the square below the hill and looked up at the Han as a stranger might see it. Its great gate stood square and straight, its iron-oiled black. Its outer walls, repointed, showed clean pale mortar between honey-colored stones. In the arcade windows, 10 of them along the ground floor, hung shutters of pine oiled a soft red-brown, behind the shutters glowed the yellow squares of the newly glazed windows. Above the gate, on a plank of oak burned with a hot iron in her own hand, hung the new sign, Aksoy Hani ve Taz Atalayasai, the Aksoy Han and Stone Workshop. She opened for business on the 21st of June, and in the first month she took in a party of 4 Dutch geologists studying the tuff, a lone French photographer, a family of 6 from Istanbul whose car had broken down, and, as her first workshop client, a delegation of 3 elders from the village of Sofular, who arrived to ask, with grave formality, whether the young lady from the Han might consider recutting the millstone at their communal mill. Word had, it seemed, traveled, and in the market at Nevsur, when she went in for supplies now, the merchants no longer called her the girl who bought the fool's Han. They called her Damla Hanim, Miss Damla, and they had her sacks of lime ready before she asked. A day at the Han, by the second summer, ran like this. She woke at 5 with the first grey light in the courtyard, dressed in the small room off the workshop that was now her bedroom, and drew the first bucket from the well. By 6 she had lit the fire in the kitchen and had a small tin pot of tea going on the stove. And by 6:30 iced teas had come up the hill with the day's bread and had settled onto the courtyard bench for the quarter of an hour of unhurried conversation that had become the frame of both their mornings. At 7 Hassan Usta arrived, and at 7:10 they were in the workshop under the great vault of the old stables, and whatever the day's job was, a cracked lintel from Sofular. A slumped tomb vault from Yukasar, a Byzantine capital rescued from a collapsed church wall. They bent to it together, the old man and the young woman, the trowel and the mallet. Until the sun rose over the eastern arcade and made the dust in the workshop air into a slow gold snow. Guests came and went through the gate in the middle of the day, and Yusuf came up on Saturdays with his tongs. On Tuesday afternoons, 3 children from the village came up the hill, a boy of 10 and 2 girls of 8 and 11, and Elif set them to work on small squares of soft tuff with small chisels. And she taught them, as her father had taught her, to feel for the true face of the stone, and the sound of the 3 small hammers, uneven and eager, was, she thought, the exact sound a building needed to hear if it was going to go on standing for another 800 years. The Han, which had been the town's ruin, had become the town's heart. The workshop paid the lodging's bills in the winter, and the lodging paid the workshop's bills in the summer, and Cappadocia, which had been dying since 1912, had, by some small mercy, stopped dying. On a quiet evening in the September of her 3rd year at the Han, the arcades cool, the courtyard swept. The last of the guests gone up to their rooms, Elif climbed the broad stone stair and unlocked the door of what had been Ibrahim Effendi's room and was now her office. It was hers, and it was also, still, his. She had kept the walnut desk and the iron bedstead and the peg by the door. And she had added only a shelf of books along the north wall and a small map of the Han pinned above the desk. She lit the oil lamp. She preferred it, still, to the electric bulb she had wired in the year before, and she sat down in the walnut chair. And she took 2 small objects from the drawer and set them side by side on the desk in the lamplight. The brass plumb bob, on its frayed cotton line, scratched and lead heavy, this, she thought, was a guide to the true line. The thing my father gave me so that I would always know when a wall was standing straight. The silver key, on its faded green ribbon, cool and simple, this was a permission to build. The thing Ibrahim Effendi left me so that I would know that a building could wait 200 years for the right hand to open it. She sat with them for a long while, and outside the high window the last swallows of the evening turned once around the courtyard and went to their nests in the upper courses of the arcade. She thought, without bitterness, of her uncle Mahmut. He had written to her once, in the spring of the 2nd year, a short careful letter in his upright merchant's hand. He had heard, from someone who had heard from someone, that she had a small business in Cappadocia, and he was pleased for her, and he hoped she was well, and he had enclosed, as a small gift, a bank draft for 1,000 lira. She had written back a warm short letter of thanks, and she had returned the draft, and she had never heard from him again, and she did not blame him for either the writing or the silence. He had done what a man of his worldview could do. He had balanced, in his own ledger, what he understood to be owed. He had never imagined, and could not have imagined, that the 12,000 lira he had counted out onto the walnut of his desk that Wednesday in March would, by way of a hillside and a plumb bob and a 200-year-old letter, become this, a courtyard, a workshop, a warm kitchen, 3 children with chisels, a widow with a red cloth parcel, an old mason with a trowel, a blacksmith with a laugh. There was no line in his ledger for any of that, and she did not hold that against him. It was simply that his ledger and hers had turned out, in the end, to be measuring different things. Elif Damla Aksoy, who had been 24 years old and, for all practical purposes, unemployed on a Wednesday in March, closed the drawer, blew out the lamp, and sat for a moment in the dark room listening to the small old sound of the Han around her, the beams settling, the swallows shifting, the well breathing its cold breath in the courtyard below. She had spent, in the end, exactly 4,780 lira on a caravanserai that no one had wanted for 200 years. It was, she thought, the best 4,780 lira anyone had ever spent. It had bought her more than a building, and it had bought her more than a home. It had bought her a life along a true line, and a door that had been waiting, patiently, for her hand.